The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms, with, by the way, quality audio equipment today.
Oh, it sounds so good.
Because I'm sitting across the desk from Nephi Cole.
Yep, if there's one thing we're good at, Dave, it's gear.
If there's one thing you're good at, is getting everybody into good gear.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say we're good at gear. You're good at gear, and then by association, it's like osmosis.
Well, it's a team thing.
Yeah.
We're a team. I don't know how to read, so I need your help.
Mike McGrady is with us today, too. Hey, Mike.
Yep. How's it going?
Hey, doing very well. How are you doing? Let me guess.
Never
been better. Yeah, there it is.
That's right.
Predictable.
And we are joined today. Before I introduce our guest, let me give a little context on this. So, go back a few months ago. And I say a few months ago, Nephi and I are talking, and we say, do you notice there's this podcast out there that's doing exactly the same thing we're doing, just better? And we went out and checked it out, and
we really did have this conversation. Well, Dave was like, "Who is this? They're covering the same subjects that we are."
Like almost at the same time. It was almost eerie. Like
Yep.
We were covering a lot of the same topics.
All true.
Perhaps in a slightly different way, different format, but thought this is interesting. And then
Clearly someone very intelligent.
it has to be.
Yeah.
It has
and
to be.
LinkedIn to be covering the same stuff that we are covering.
Yeah, it has to be.
Yeah.
So then fast forward a couple of months, and you initiated a conversation with this person, Nephi, and started having a conversation and invited her to join. I think you were the one that sent the invitation to join us on a whitetail
A
hunt.
mutual friend deserves credit.
Okay.
So a mutual friend, Mark Oliva, from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, is actually the one that introduced me to our guest, Gabriella Hoffman.
Host of the District of Conservation podcast.
Gabriella, how you doing?
I'm doing well, guys. It's good to see you again after our fun time in Wyoming.
Yeah, it was super fun. So yeah, we had this opportunity where I had Game and Fish Commissioner Mike Schmidt. Maybe I shouldn't have dropped his name because I don't want anybody else to call him, but he needed some help. He had to do a coal operation for a bunch of deer on his place and said, "Hey, do you think you can help me out?" So I said, "Yeah, I could probably help you out." And so I called a variety of friends and put together a group to come out there, and basically we tried to put together a hunt for people to come out, and we had a mix of new hunters, and then we had some notable personalities and vets and veterans and some industry professionals from the firearms industry come out, and I think did a fairly successful job of like reducing some of the deer numbers on that ranch.
I'd say so. My daughter contributed to the reduction. I didn't.
Yeah.
but my daughter did. The whole Your Mountain team was represented there. Mike and his daughter were there.
Yep, that's right.
Gabriella was there.
Gabriella was there, and so we had the District of Conservation and the Your Mountain podcast there, and we didn't do any podcasting.
No, we didn't. I think Gabriella did. Is that right?
I did a little bit with Mike, and I used whatever audio transcription from the video portion I was doing because I don't have this SLC cable yet from B&H Photo. I'm still waiting on it. So I was able to find a way to sync my audio and video. And I was able to do that and put that into some podcasting and video.
It was really good, by the way. I reviewed the stuff that you did and super good work. And now that you're on our podcast, we're sorry to take you down that level of having to come down and slum with us. But
good.
It was clearly the two best policy, natural resource policy podcasts in the nation were in the same place at the same time.
They were. So we want to talk about that hunt a little bit, Gabriella, but first, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? Give us some background on you.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, of course. But for me, unlike a lot of people kind of in our space, I'm new to hunting, but I'm not new to the outdoors at all. I grew up fishing primarily in Southern California, and I loved doing that with my dad, and he's responsible for my fishing addiction. And when I moved over to the East Coast, to the Washington, D.C. area, I picked up an interest in shooting sports a bit more, and then subsequently with hunting, because all these people I was interacting with in politics were talking up shooting sports, we're talking up hunting, and they're like, well, since you're starting to write about these issues, you might as well participate in them. So I got plugged into the industry. About 5 or 6 years ago, I went to my first SHOT Show, and from there it's been kind of history in a sense, and I've grown to love working with people in this space. There's a lot of commonalities, a lot of shared heritage and shared interests and different subjects that we all can get around, and you obviously have differences, so I love how dynamic it is, and writing about these issues in this space has been really fun. I've won an award for my work. I try to focus on controversial subjects that don't get the proper due. I covered the grizzly bear issue. I think we talked about that a little bit in Wyoming, and I got that about 1.5 years ago, so that was really cool. And yeah, it's been good now to actually embed myself in hunting in addition to writing about it, because it would look funny if I write about it and I have no proximity to the activity. And I picked up hunting about 3-4 seasons ago, was successful first with upland birds. I got some rooster pheasant, a few quail and chukar, and that really sealed the deal for me with hunting. And I've had some kind of a mixed bag with wild game animals then. I've gotten some waterfowl, I've gotten wild boar, missed deer twice before our successful weekend in Wyoming. So 3rd time's the charm with whitetail there. But yeah, I've grown to be, I guess, a hunter. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I never tout expertise, and kind of how my podcast differs a little bit from you guys is you guys actually worked kind of directly in policy. I kind of cover it from the media perspective, but use a lot of policy. So you guys are a little step ahead of me, but I kind of come about it from an observer and someone who works in Washington, D.C. too, and kind of translate stuff to layman's terms, just because it can be a little convoluted and difficult to kind of extrapolate a lot of stuff from public policy. And sometimes it's a little bit headache inducing, even for me, although I like this stuff. But yeah, I've embedded myself and been engrossed in this, and I really like it. And I try to preach to other people how they can successfully do this within their means if they're limited by finances or inability to access land. I always try to tell people that there are opportunities around you. There are some private means to overcome challenges. We have great companies here on the East Coast that help people try to access hunting land and fishing land a little better if people are a little uncomfortable with public land access. And yeah, I just kind of do the gamut of different things. I also run a consulting business. That's how I stay afloat, because I can't make a living off of being a writer, sadly. But I do a multitude of things, and yeah, the podcast is one of them. But it's a lot of fun, and it's really fun to be in the industry from both the journalistic standpoint and then also somewhat from the business standpoint too.
So let me ask you about that the podcast. I'm curious, because we all have our reasons for wanting to do these projects and why we got. And I think people that listen to us know why we decided to
Dave's
get
is
into
fame.
our podcast.
So Dave wanted to be.
I just wanted to be wealthy and famous.
Yeah.
And turns out podcasting isn't the way to do that. No. Either one of those things. But I'm curious what made you interested. Like, what got you interested in starting a podcast, and why did you choose the District of Conservation? Why did you choose this podcast and these subject matters?
Yeah, I noticed there was kind of a deficit of people who live in close proximity to Washington, D.C. talking about this. And I was on the cusp about 2 years ago of being a late bloomer and kind of an early adopter to podcasting. I think you guys probably had that same experience too. I think you started your podcast a little bit earlier than mine, but I noticed it was a good opportunity to explore the medium. And I didn't want to just create another podcast with my name in it or another political podcast. There's so many different political podcasts out there, and it was just such an exhaustive topic. So I was like, the wilderness podcast, or previously the outdoor podcast category, wasn't really populated with content. You obviously had the Meat Eater podcasts and their affiliated podcasts and other similar kind of high profile podcasts, but you didn't really have it be such a saturated medium. So I was like, I'm interested in these subjects. I interact with a lot of politicians, some newsmakers, people really making waves in the outdoor industry locally in the Mid-Atlantic. And I know a lot of people across the country. So I was like, I might as well take my existing network and highlight people who are really doing outstanding stuff. And then also couple that with interesting policy discussions or good or bad policy that is emanating from the nation's capital, and anything that I found to be compelling and interesting from kind of the state houses and state legislatures around me in Virginia, which is my home, and then also Maryland, Pennsylvania, and then anything, I guess, across the country too. I've expanded it, but largely focusing on the Mid-Atlantic and then kind of expanding from there, because everything I feel is relevant, whatever emanates from the federal bench and federal kind of channel, it percolates down to the state legislatures and obviously to locality. So everything is kind of interrelated. So that was kind of the reason behind the name District of Conservation, kind of a play on District of Columbia. I don't know where it came from. I was just like, I have to have something that's kind of a play on the region, but also tie it to the fact symbolically that because of Pittman Robertson, what we were talking about a little bit earlier before going live, how that law is so important and a great vehicle and obviously a mechanism from which a lot of funding is dispersed to different states. So everything that happens federally relates heavily to what happens in states. So kind of that symbolism behind there and that little connection through that law, kind of subconsciously, I was thinking that would be kind of an interesting name. So it sticks. It's not super long. People can remember it when they think of District of Columbia. They think, okay, this kind of conservation related play on District of Columbia. And it's stuck, and people have taken a little bit of notice to it. We've had some good guests on the program. It's been fun learning how to edit and splice and dice and make it nice. I wish I could have some help on it, but it's okay. I like the editing myself. But it's another good learned skill. I really like it, and I'm glad people are taking an interest in it.
No, you're doing a great job, I think, and I'm really interested in some of the stuff that you just shared. And you talked about getting into the space, and a lot of people, if you don't know, our first guest was on this podcast was actually Steve Ranella, and we thought that we were real trendsetters when we went and started a podcast with Steve, and we'd been on his podcast a couple times, and I think it was right about the time when he was launching all those other podcasts. I don't think he'd done it yet, so he was just kind of
it was actually a few months after that he launched the other podcast.
His
network.
Yeah, so we thought we were real special, but anyway, yeah, it was a lot of fun. We went and hung out in his garage, and then. I love your space, and I love what you talk about in District of Conservation, because you have a unique thing going for you that we don't, which is you're actually very well connected with what's going on in the politics of DC at any given moment. And we kind of follow it from a tertiary level, and yeah, we were involved with it, professionally, and still are to some degree. But I get the impression, I like listening to your podcast because you get the impression that you are right there, right now, talking to the people who are advising folks in DC. Literally you're going to the restaurants with these people. You're rubbing shoulders with these people on a weekly basis. That's something we don't have going for us.
Mainly because we're not allowed to travel right now. But yeah, just kidding.
I haven't really been rubbing elbows with a lot of the flax in DC recently because everything is kind of hampered down. But I have in the past, especially last year, I was able to interface with Secretary Bernhardt and some of the others. And now I just do things from a distance like you guys too. But it is interesting to kind of rub shoulders with the who's who. I've been interviewing a lot of incoming lawmakers who work in the conservation space. And there's actually a lot of them, especially on the Republican side, who care about these issues. So that's something people can expect from me. And it's nice to kind of see that issue being taken up by people on the center right a little more. So we're going to start to see that, I think.
What do you think about that transition? So, and maybe we can just cover it broadly. So we have these new lawmakers coming in. You said you've talked to some of those. Maybe you can address that, but maybe we can kick the can a little bit about just transition in government. We've got a variety of new people coming in, not just the Congress, but of course the presidency and the agencies. Dave? Gabriella, who wants to go first?
Just to start out, like what to expect?
Transition.
Like, how does it work?
What's happening? Like, what do we see coming down with this, the new Congress? What do we see coming down with these new folks who are coming in? What are your thoughts?
Well, so I guess one thing, we kind of talked a couple episodes ago about how the transition process works, but do you want to touch on that a little bit too?
Go.
Yeah. Okay. So whomever, and Gabriella, jump in whenever, because I may be totally out of line here, totally misspeaking. You may have better insight on this than I do, but the way these, the different campaigns have had effectively a transition team in place for months, right? It's not like November, election day happens in November, and then they start putting together a transition team. Right? There's a transition team in place so that on election day, and plans in place so that on election day you can start implementing it. If they win, they can start implementing that transition, right? Yep. So the Biden team here, they had people populating this team, giving advice on what transition might look like. There are something like 3,500 or 4,000 appointed positions across the federal government that have to be filled.
It's mind-numbing when you think about that number, just how many people now you're going to shuffle in and then shuffle out.
Right. And so you need to have a network, a big network, a big team that has expertise in all the different federal agencies that can then reach out to their own networks to try and start vetting names for people to fill these appointed positions. And we hear about the Secretary of Interior and the Administrator of the EPA and Secretary of Agriculture. And sure, the cabinet level positions are critically important, and those are the ones that you're going to hear about. But there are literally thousands of other positions that are important, from the agency directors to assistant secretaries to solicitors, deputy assistant secretaries. There's just all sorts of people. And so think about the Interior office. There's a depending on who it is, they're going to call it a landing team or a beachhead team or whatever. It's going to be those people that are sent into the agency to embed in the agency. They're given some office space. They come in and they start getting to know they'll start having interviews with staff, right, and getting to know the staff. But they're also going to start formulating their strategy for what their priorities are going to be when they take over in January. Right? So they're going to be vetting people for transition, but they're also going to be vetting ideas for transition as well, and being prepared to hit the ground running, because they recognize that once they're in office, their timeline to get things done is short. So it's just constantly spinning, moving, trying to move this process along, and vetting people and so forth. So that's the kind of the background. Gabriella, you have anything you want to add on that? Sorry, I hogged some time there.
No, I actually didn't know that little tidbit. It makes sense that there would be people who come in, kind of observe what's happening and assess what they'll take away from it or what they'll perhaps reform or undo. But have you guys taken a look at the possible candidates that are being vetted? I examined a few of them on the podcast, but I don't know if you guys took a look to see kind of their track records, their viability for confirmation. Have you looked to see who some of those candidates are yet?
For which agencies? Because are you talking Interior?
Then we'll get to, I haven't really looked into, I should say, energy or EPA. Like, some names are being floated for EPA and BLM, but I just wanted to first focus on Interior because that's kind of what's been talked about at length so far in terms of transition news. But I think there are like 3 or 4 names that are being seriously touted. Have you guys seen those names?
Yeah, so we've also talked about this a little bit too in the past, how sometimes the names that float to the top right now that are discussed wind up not being the name that's, like, it's that shiny object that everybody wants to talk about. And then there's somebody that's very quietly going through a process that's being vetted.
Well, let's pick
that
one.
Comes out.
Let's talk about one. So we've all heard Heinrich, right? Or no?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So Heinrich.
Yeah. Senator Heinrich from New Mexico, yeah.
Which is not going to happen.
Yes.
Like, it's just politically, it's not going to happen.
Although I really like Senator Heinrich.
I do too.
He would be.
Yeah. So
David, why not?
Well, I'm interested in Gabriella's take. I have my take on why not, but maybe Gabriella disagrees. So what do you think?
I
that
have
one you
no
covered?
idea in terms of a crystal ball. Yeah, I did talk about him actually. I would say, I mean, he's certainly very beholden to whatever agenda Biden wants to do. But I would say of the names being floated, he's probably the most connected to sportsmen of the 3 or 4. I don't know if we're counting Bullock in this discussion, but of the 3 New Mexico representatives that are being floated as possible picks, he's probably the most pro sportsman, I would say. But he certainly would go along with kind of enacting a climate agenda. That's what we're going to see a lot of these nominees going to be enacting, more so than a conservation agenda. Yeah, so I don't know if he's being like the top. They say that Udall would probably be the most practical pick and confirmable pick, but they're also floating Deb Haaland as like the progressive pick. House Natural Resources Committee Chairman Raul Grijalva put in a letter in support of her, and you see a lot of different progressive kind of preservationist interests putting their support behind her. So it's kind of this mixed bag. You see kind of this tussle between Udall and her. But maybe Heinrich will be the surprise pick. I have no idea.
Well, it's interesting. And I got to say, from a sportsman's perspective, that would be great. You know, we look at that probably, and here's probably what colors are thinking on it. As a sportsman, you're like immediately like, well, Heinrich, perfect. You know, because he is an outdoors music sportsman, because how do we think of federal lands, right? Our bias is towards thinking of them as the public lands that we go hunt and fish. We think of those agencies primarily, but what does everybody else see with interior? Energy. Right. They see oil, they see gas, they see a place to put up windmills. And so they see people that will, you know, either A, further oil and gas development, or B, curtail some of that development on public lands. And so I think, you know, maybe that's where, you know, some of these folks, like, honestly, as a sportsman, I gravitate towards thinking about the Bullocks and the Heinrichs and those folks that I just think of as being that community rather than the other.
Yeah. And to get to the earlier question of, why don't I think Heinrich is, like, it's fun to hear his name tossed around, but why I think, like, it's virtually no chance that Heinrich becomes the Secretary of Interior. It's because you're going to have this, and we've talked about this before, you're going to have this razor-thin margin in the Senate.
Yep.
Like this razor-thin margin of control in the Senate, you know, by 1 or 2 seats, depending on how Georgia pans out, right? And if you appoint a sitting senator to a cabinet-level position, now that seat has to be filled. Depending on the politics of that state or the processes in that state, maybe you have to go through a special election. You don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. And so there is some political risk in appointing this year, in nominating a sitting senator for a cabinet level position.
Yeah, that holds true also for Senator Tom Udall out of New Mexico.
No. Oh, which
Tom Udall.
Yeah.
But Mark Udall,
right,
out of Colorado, that's a different story.
So now here's where Nephi gets going. Right? Now, as tradition, this is where I'm going to argue with Dave. And so, but all that said is true. But I'm just going to throw that out there, and I'm going to argue this point, even though I don't think I'm right. Which is, though, if
I love that you're going to argue something even though you don't think you're right.
No, I don't.
That's
think
just
so.
the way you are. You just
you
got to argue something.
Hey, somebody's got to bring up those counterpoints. But let's just assume, though, what's unique about Heinrich is he is in a state that is politically friendly to his party. So it's not like the governor of New Mexico. You know, if Heinrich leaves the Senate to go run Interior, it's not like, you know, in some states, like let's say Tester in Montana. So Tester in Montana is a great, you know,
and we've talked about that one for Secretary of Agriculture.
Yeah,
but that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. Why? Because who's the governor?
Right.
Greg Gianforte, who is a Republican.
But Montana's not an appointed
special election there.
It's a special election.
Yes.
And how does that Montana play out? It's largely Republican.
Yes. So so the politics of that state. Yeah, the politics of that state don't lend to them keeping that seat the way that they want it. Whereas New Mexico, you could argue that the politics of New Mexico do allow for you to scoop somebody up out of the Senate in New Mexico.
But do you want to roll the dice on that? Or do you want to take the sure thing?
Of course I do.
Do you want to take the sure thing like a retiring senator?
Did I not say I'm going to argue this point? I'm rolling it.
So the only thing that Nephi likes better than being right is arguing.
That's true.
So some of the other names of folks who are not sitting senators that would create a issue for the razor thin margin are that I've seen kicked around would be Mark Begich, former senator from Alaska. Obviously, we mentioned Steve Bullock, Representative Gabriella out of Arizona.
Grijalva?
Would give up a chairmanship.
Grijalva.
Yeah. And then
It's
David
not going to be
Hayes,
Grijalva.
I wish it was, though.
Former deputy secretary, executive director, State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU Law, David Hayes. So there's a couple other non-sitting senators that it potentially could be. But as we also mentioned, these could be names that either just being thrown out there as eye candy, potential headline grabbing things, or ones that they're sort of floating themselves to try to elevate their profile into the potential mix. But yeah, there could be some other candidate we don't even know about.
So Gabrielle, do you have a favorite and a dark horse?
Oh gosh. That's interesting that you pose that question. Independent of my personal feelings, because I think they'll take the interior in a direction that I largely probably would disagree with. But if I had to be pragmatic and objective, probably the most practical pick probably would be a Heinrich, just because he wouldn't alienate the outdoor community and sportsman community so much. If they really want to go crazy, and maybe the dark horse would be this New Mexico representative. She would be the first Native American Interior Secretary ever. I don't know if they're going to go for that. She seems a little too progressive to be confirmed in a very divided Senate, but that could be someone that they're floating around. But I think maybe either of those two New Mexican representatives probably would be considered, or maybe as Mike said, there could be someone who we don't know, maybe a Begich or someone like that.
So where do you think Udall falls in the mix? Because I actually think, from my perspective, he's my front runner.
Udall is?
Yeah.
Why?
Long-standing relationship with Biden, long-standing personal relationship with Biden. He's pretty well respected by the hunting community and the broader conservation community. Retiring senator that there was an attempt in this Congress multiple times to get some legacy bills passed for him, and it just couldn't get done. And so maybe when starting to think about legacy, you elevate to a role of Secretary of Interior and try and implement some legacy work through that. That's just there just seem to be a lot of pieces there that make some sense, and a fairly practical pick, pretty pragmatic, center left, confirmable, all those things factor in. That's why I would have him as a front runner in my book.
Politico has the top choice.
Politico does?
Mm-hmm. They have a full breakdown of like the top candidate and like the two lower tier candidates, and he is listed as their top. Citing kind of. Wow.
And who are their lower tier?
Heinrich and Halland.
Nephi, you didn't make the list.
Once again, it's like I didn't last time either.
Man,
no,
unbelievable.
No, but you know what I do want to know?
Yeah,
where's Land County going to be? What's Land going to be doing in Interior? Dave,
I'm not going to do any prognosticating there.
I'm just
not even a little bit. But this is my ongoing effort to get Land Tawny, to get Land to actually listen to more of our podcasts. I'm just going to try and throw his name out now on every podcast. Every single time.
All right, Nephi, what do you think he's qualified for?
Land?
Yeah.
Let me think. I think, give me some time.
It's just Mike. While Nephi is thinking, so I enjoy having these discussions. I think they're, it's fun. It's like picking winners in football games and stuff. Everybody likes to talk about who's going to win the World Series, who's going to win the NBA Finals, who's going to win the college playoff, like who's going to be there. And then at the end of the day, we always get surprised. And these secretary positions, it's always fun to do this, all this prognosticating and predicting. And then we usually get surprised in the end. It pretty rarely pans out how at this stage in the game, how people are talking about it.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that William Perry Pendley will, in fact, vacate his seat at the Bureau of Land Management, that's the perfect spot for Lantoni. That job. Just the job that, like, it never goes away. Everybody's, somebody's throwing darts at him all the time.
So like principal deputy director of the Bureau of Land Management.
That's
but
the
not
job.
The director.
No, that's the job I want for land.
Okay.
Okay. Not the director, principal deputy director.
Yeah, you liked it? You like that choice? Doesn't have to be confirmed.
Yeah, apparently it doesn't.
Yeah, can wield all power of whoever they need to whenever necessary and is invulnerable. You like it, don't you?
There's a lot of power there when you don't have an actual director.
Yeah, you like it.
Gabriella, what are your thinking transition? Like beyond the secretary level, what other things would you be thinking about? As you mentioned that you thought in a Biden administration the agenda might change to more of a climate focus than more of a, I don't know if you said land conservation or other general conservation focus. I'm curious, one, why, and two, how do you think that will manifest itself? Like, what kind of policies would you anticipate seeing?
Well, Biden has declared that he views, and this is independent of what I think anyone thinks on climate change or climate issues, but he says that climate change is the biggest security threat. And obviously that'll be relegated to Defense Department, but I don't know if that's going to translate to Department of Interior. But from all the articles that have talked up these different nominees for Interior Secretary, a lot of them have mentioned that, well, while some of them may be more moderate, albeit loyal to Biden, they're fully on board with his climate agenda and issues like 3030, which
didn't they also involve John Kerry as a presidential advisor? I mean, a White House advisor on climate change, elevating that to kind of a czar type position.
Yep, Mike is correct. Yeah.
I actually think in the debate, in the presidential debate, second one was the first time climate change was ever mentioned in a presidential debate, right?
I have no idea.
I think it was.
I think it's been talked about before.
I'm not sure that it has.
Well, we're just gonna.
It's been talked about, but not as an actual question. One of the handful of questions in a presidential debate. I think that might have been a first, and that was just to sort of highlight your point that that obviously this is going to be a priority of the incoming administration.
So they put Biden put him on as the presidential special envoy on climate change, and he has a seat on the National Security Council.
John Kerry.
Yeah. So obviously that's a foreign policy and military matter, but it's such an early point in time to be throwing something like that out, demonstrating the importance across all agencies climate change will be to this presidential administration.
So I've had arguments with Dave over this, not just on the podcast, but in reality, where we've talked about what a new administration coming in, what it means to sportsmen. So I do think that the Trump administration didn't get enough credit on behalf of the things that they did that were beneficial for sportsmen. And I think that the incoming administration, there's a lot of people talking about, well, if they have an environmental focus, climate focus, that's going to benefit sportsmen. But I've always argued that to be a tertiary benefit, not a primary benefit to sportsmen. Gabrielle, what are your thoughts on a shift in, is there going to be a shift in focus? And then how does a shift in focus from maybe sportsmen's issues? Because I do believe, that Trump's pretty heavy on it. How does it shift? What do sportsmen see as being different in a new administration? Any thoughts?
There are a lot of points to digest from that. And the reason why I take away that climate will be a central focus is if you look at how the House Natural Resources Committee changed hands on their focus when Raul Grijalva took over the chairmanship, he injected climate issues into the committee. And I've spoken to a lot of people in committee who said, while those are compelling issues, they belong more so in energy and those related committees, not so much land and conservation type issues that are typically discussed and mulled in House Natural Resources Committee. So I feel like that same priority, like what we see in the committee right now under Democrat control, it's going to translate, I think, into Department of Interior. So maybe I look for trends and maybe I'm completely off mark here, but I feel like we're going to see kind of that same emphasis also in Department of Interior. And it seems like that with all the different picks, because a lot of them do support somewhat of a Green New Deal. Even Heinrich, I was very surprised to see that. Him and Udall are chief co-sponsors of the Senate version, one of 17 or two of 17 co-sponsors. So they'll certainly be in support of something. So they could, even though they voted to confirm some Trump administration appointees, they'll still be in Biden's kind of favors and graces. I think so. They could still be confirmed and still be viewed as sufficiently left of center for what the administration is looking for. And you do see that with a lot of their talking points, this 30-30 plan, which has actually attracted a lot of bipartisan disapproval. I've talked at length about this with several guests on my podcast, from the sport fishing side to the Congressional Sportsman Foundation kind of perspective too. So you see fishing and hunting interests really kind of taking a pause at this proposal, which I think stemmed from the United Nations, if I recall correctly, and how it would actually kind of exclude people from accessing public land and public water, kind of defeating the public land mantra that we kind of hear that a lot of in our community talk about. So it's a very kind of regressive policy. There are a lot of problems potentially laced in it, and they're very keen, according to Biden's policy platform on his campaign website, to just these different articles coming out on these candidates. They all are kind of echoing this. I think they're certainly not going to pursue gray wolf delisting. We won't see much of ESA reforms coming out of this incoming administration for sure. I'm not sure how that court case is going to pan out, with the Center for Biological Diversity suing Department of Interior to scale back on some of the openings on Fish and Wildlife Service lands. I think we're going to see probably kind of one of the first directives be to kind of reinstall what Dan Ash did right as he was leaving his post in Interior, to ban lead tackle and bullets on Fish and Wildlife Service lands. So we'll see, I think, kind of this emphasis on environmental policy more so than sportsmen's issues. And they'll certainly like throw the bone to sportsmen. I know Obama's administration did have a hunting and shooting sports council, but you really didn't hear much about it from what I remember. But you would hear more so of kind of their environmental aims. And they would, again, kind of throw the bone to some conservation issues. They would expand access. But I think sportsmen had a bigger seat at the table. I know this from having spoken to Interior Secretary Bernhardt and just the different individuals I've interviewed kind of below him as well, former advisors who got me plugged into the administration and kind of their musings and kept me abreast with some updates. So we're going to see, I think, that shift away from it because they don't want to alienate some of their more preservationist type Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, supporters. So because they have the backing of all these different groups, I think they're going to shy away from sportsmen's issues just because politics and money and influence talks. They're really dead set on it. They're going to, like Mike and I were talking earlier, they really do have this emphasis on climate already early in the game, and they're going to dictate to the other agencies, I think, especially the ones that handle these issues, and place it in Interior to kind of prioritize it. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens there, and if they're going to forbid or prevent future oil and gas leases on public lands too, or just focus on renewable or forgo both altogether.
It's going to be a wild few years.
All right, can I play?
Go ahead.
I've been sitting nice and quiet, right? Can I play in the sandbox?
Yeah.
All right. So, to address both of them, and I'm going to play devil's advocate on some of this
That's
stuff.
good.
Too, right?
I like that.
So, to Nephi's point first, and then to Gabriella. Nephi, I think you said the Trump administration was good for sportsmen from a primary level, and then some of these other issues are more tertiary, like what you'd expect from the Biden administration would be more tertiary benefits, right?
That's exactly what I said.
Right. So I just want to make sure I'm right on that. So when we talk about benefits to sportsmen, the point I've always made is that the Trump administration was great for sportsmen from an access to opportunity standpoint. So if you wanted to be able to have access for hunting and angling, the Trump administration was great for that, opening up millions more acres of wildlife refuges, which, by the way, a lot of the money for wildlife refuges comes from hunters and anglers, right? But from that standpoint, like pure access standpoint and opportunity, which is a big part of hunting, having access and opportunity. The Trump administration was great. But one of the other parts of hunting, right, is habitat and animals. And while the states manage the wildlife, it's the private landowners, and here in the West, it's the federal government that really manages the habitat. And so the decisions that an administration makes from a land use standpoint on how land use is prioritized and for what purposes can have, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the next, it can have
a tertiary benefit
or detriment, right? And I don't call it tertiary. It's an absolute direct benefit. It's just the timing of when it happens is at a later date, like because it takes longer for the action to occur, right? And so when you look at like a Biden administration, the types of priorities that I would anticipate coming out, I think climate's going to be a big, obviously it's going to be a big focus, and how they incorporate climate discussions into individual agency management or individual agency decision making and priorities is going to be interesting. But here's what I would think from a public lands agency's type of standpoint. I think what you'll probably see is the administration come in and put a temporary moratorium on issuing oil and gas leases, like the Obama administration did for coal leases, to re-examine. They can't stop leasing. They can put a temporary moratorium. You have the Federal Mineral Leasing Act that requires quarterly lease sales, but the administration can analyze what qualifies as lands that would be available for a quarterly lease sale. So I would anticipate a pause and a revisiting of that. And there could be some benefits for landowners there. I mean, that's a really complicated issue, and there are some acres that are leased that maybe shouldn't be leased because they're such low priority. And it prevents groups like Mule Deer Foundation, or I don't want to throw names out there because I don't know if it actually does, but there are groups that I know that a decision to lease federal lands for oil and gas development weighs into their decision about whether to invest their money into habitat improvement projects for the animals that we like to hunt or fish, or fish, to hunt. So those types of policy decisions have impacts on what other organizations use their money that then we directly benefit from as hunters and anglers. And so that's one policy that I anticipate would happen. They can't stop. I mean, plus you have millions of acres under lease. They can't prevent people that have a property right in a lease on federal lands from developing. They can condition permits. They can make it hard, but they can't prevent the use of those leases. So I think we're going to see a shift in how lands are leased, what types of lands are leased, how permits are issued, although there could be legal challenges to that. And then, I think there's going to be a really concerted effort on how we use our public lands, federal lands for wind, solar, other renewables. I think and that all fits into the carbon conversation. And those come with their own question marks about what their impacts are on landscapes and how you cite those, right? So I think there are going to be some land-based decisions. Do I think they're going to be unfriendly to sportsmen? I don't think so. I really don't. Gabriella, you mentioned that lawsuit the Center for Biological Diversity filed on the access, the opening up access to all these different places, wildlife refuges. The thing about that confuses me a little bit, and we've talked about this in the past, but that's an annual decision. They're required by law to make this decision annually on what lands are going to be open. And so theoretically, you file this lawsuit and challenge it, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to issue a new directive next summer on what's going to be open for the following seasons. And it kind of moots out the issue here unless they're the exact same lands. There are some unresolved questions there. But at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to get shut out. I don't think we're going to, from an access standpoint, I don't think we're going to get shut out. I don't think we're going to see in the short term a ton of changes on the types of uses on federal lands. We're going to see kind of that needle move on what the policy objectives are. And so we might, in 4 or 8 years or whatever it is, we might be talking more and more about the concerns people have with wind and solar development on public lands instead of oil and gas development on public lands. Just same argument, different players, right?
Do you think there would be a potential for the climate change objectives that would shy away from energy development from public lands of any kind affecting the bottom line in dollars that come back that benefit sportsmen?
It's a great question, Mike.
Like LWCF?
It depends, right? Because LWCF comes from offshore, so it
and
depends
just
on
leasing money,
it
how
depends
much-
on what the offshore policy turns out to be. But
Yeah, I mean,
but you
because
want to talk about
I've seen sort of memos developed to try to influence the transition and the policy development that would essentially eliminate offshore drilling in oil and gas leasing.
right, which is actually a lot of states were pushing Trump to do, and Trump actually issued moratoriums on lease sales offshore in off the coast of Florida, and I think a couple of other states too. And now there's a push to do it all over the place in a future administration. And what I think a lot of hunters don't recognize is that that Land and Water Conservation Fund money, those dollars that are coming back to open up access areas and open up access and create new opportunities, that's coming from oil and gas lease sales. And so if that does get shut down, it creates a revenue gap. So it struck me, and I think we've talked about this, struck me as odd. It'd be odd timing to spend years and years advocating for making LWCF funding permanent,
and then take away
the source of funding within a year or two. And so I think there's a policy line that you have to walk there. You have to tread very carefully.
Yeah, well, and here's another thing to think about with those. So we talked about LWCF offshore. You have an administration now that said it's going to halt leasing for oil and gas, at least take a look at it on federal lands, right? But what happens when a company comes into a state and starts developing that mineral and starts taking that mineral out of the ground? What happens to that money, Dave?
It's split.
Yes.
Yeah, it's split about 50, just under 50-50. I think the federal government takes just over 50% and the other 50% of the royalties off of that development.
You recall
The federal government takes 50%,
and then
state gets 48%. The federal government keeps 2% to pay to administer, collecting, and distributing.
The state's portion.
But the states actually do a bunch of that.
I bring that up for two reasons.
Yeah.
And the first reason is because, so do either of you guys remember off the top of your head how much money came back to Wyoming in a given year from those tax-wise?
So it varies. It varies.
Wildly, but let's just just pull a number out of your.
I don't want to pull a number out.
Just
of
pull
my
a
books.
number.
Just pick a number.
Pick a number.
Well,
hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions of dollars for sure.
Okay. Now here's the reason I brought that up, because not only are we talking about, let's just roughly call it $1 billion, because that's much simpler. So however much money they take out, and again, so this revenue that gets paid, the tax revenue that goes back, let's just call it 50-50, some to the federal government and some to the states. What people are forgetting is when you're not developing these resources, you're taking money out of the treasury. For every one of those states, you're also taking money out of the state coffers. So it's a double whammy for states when that occurs, because not only are you not seeing revenue come in to the federal government that then comes out in programs that benefit everybody in the country, each of those states is going to see a direct negative benefit because they are not going to be able to see those revenues come into their state coffers. And that's where it affects things like education in states. It affects roads. It affects those other things that people don't necessarily think about when you think about, okay, somebody's developing on federal lands. I don't like development because I don't like development. Well, what you're missing is there's a huge number of services that many people get in these Western states as a result of taxes from that oil and gas development. So just something to think about.
It's true. It's an absolute balance. Like, it's a balancing act. Like, you don't want to have an oil rig on every section, right? That's not good as a hunter. It's not good as a hunter. We have to strike that balance of recognizing that in some places, well, one, we're sitting here under your lights and looking at your computer, and like oil and gas,
it's warm
coal,
in here.
It powers the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need it, right? We need it to live the quality of life we've come to expect in this country. But we also need open spaces because we've come to expect a certain quality of life we live here for a reason, right? Certain quality of life with the open spaces and unobstructed movement of animals and so forth. So striking that balance is hard. And hopefully the new administration will be open to conversations about how we strike that balance appropriately. Right.
Agreed.
Sorry, Gabriella, we totally ignored you now for a while.
No, I actually wanted to segue into something related to this in terms of monies. But have you guys looked into Biden's gun plan in terms of taxation? So he wants like air.
Yes.
They're scary looking weapons under NFA protections. And I go back to, and this is why I feel like sportsmen will be shut out of the conversation kind of indirectly in this case, because we obviously know that guns and ammo, that's primarily the lion's share of where all these conservation dollars are derived from through Pittman Robertson. So if he makes it harder for people to purchase guns legally through, let's say, making it more expensive, I don't know if people will still, with supply and demand, I think people will still pay higher money, but I feel like it would be a deterrent. And is that a way to slowly make it difficult for sportsmen and women to be the primary funders of it and find another mechanism for funding? Like if those monies are not there, where are they going to get conservation dollars from? So that's kind of something that's been on my mind, like how his potential plans to tax guns to make it a lot more difficult for people to procure them in a legal fashion, how that'll affect conservation dollars. If we see an immediate effect, 6 months, a year, whatnot, what that potentially would do detrimentally.
Let me.
Can I add one more thing before Nephi goes off on
Yeah,
this?
before I crush this fastball coming down the middle of the plate.
The other thing that comes to mind is it will probably also open up new black markets, as far as for figuring out how to get guns in the hands of people.
How to get a magazine that doesn't cost $250.
How to get guns in the hands of people that maybe can't have them or shouldn't have them, or because there is that subset of those people that we've decided shouldn't be able to have firearms. But I also think if you create a tax that's so high that it obstructs a general population from getting them, then it creates markets in other places to smuggle that kind of stuff into the country and create a black market.
Well, and I guess the question would be: is that at what level of taxation are you actually just taxing people out of a right rather than allowing it? So the proposal that you're talking about, there's a number of them, but the one that's gotten a lot of attention is to make semi-automatic weapons an NFA item. So for people that don't, that's the National Firearms Act. So which since the 30s has made things like some things that legitimately probably should be on there, like a machine gun, is an NFA item. And then there's things like suppressors are NFA items. So are short-barreled rifles, so a rifle with a barrel less than 16 inches in length. And so some of those things, I would argue, something like a short-barreled rifle, something like a suppressor, why do those even belong on there? But now the idea is you're going to add more stuff to that act. And so here's what that does in effect. If you've got an NFA item, you're talking about a $200 tax stamp for every NFA item. So every NFA item that you own, and that's going to include, if you've got a Glock 19, that, under this proposal, is an NFA item. Not only is the Glock 19, which is just a semi-automatic handgun with a magazine capacity higher than 10, not only would that be an NFA item, every magazine that you own for that handgun would also be an NFA item. So you're not just talking about the gun. So let's say you're a guy who has an AR-style rifle that you use for hunting, and you have 10 magazines for it, because a magazine for an AR only costs $10 at Sportsman's Warehouse, and they had a sale, so you picked up a bunch of magazines. Now you would have a 2,000%, am I doing my math right, tax on that magazine, and it would be, and ostensibly need to be serialized and become an NFA item for control. And literally, what's the reason to do this? It's because you don't think you have the political will to pass a law to outlaw those things, and so the idea is that you're just going to tax them such that it effectively does the same thing. And so, I think it's really problematic, especially since roughly 70% of firearms sold in this country would now be NFA items, and every magazine for those firearms would also be an NFA item. Now, not only do you have a tax issue, you have a capacity issue. And at some point, somebody's got to start talking about this, which is currently, if there's an item that's an NFA item, like let's take a suppressor. every hunter should be hunting with suppressor. It just doesn't make sense not to. If you could, why wouldn't you? Anybody that's done it knows that it's intelligent, it's smart, it makes sense for animals and people and the environment and everybody involved. Now, why don't people do that? Because before you buy a suppressor that you could probably get for $200, an entry level suppressor, you have to get a $200 tax stamp, and then you have to fill out your NFA paperwork. And your NFA paperwork, which is a Form 4 for a suppressor, is going to take you anywhere from 6 months to a year after you pay that tax stamp to get permission back to then own that NFA.
And right now, it's
item.
even because of COVID, it's even longer than that, isn't it?
I don't know what the waits are, but they are long.
I thought they could be up to 18 months now, even.
And there's not a lot of demand for it right now. So now imagine what happens when you take 70% of firearms in America. Oh, by the way, and all the magazines for those firearms, and you now put that into the system where you're going to require an you're going to the same system to do that. To me, it's a mind-boggling bureaucratic nightmare to think about actually having that happen. And it's not doable. Like if you think it cannot be done right now. And so the question then becomes, are you suggesting that because you actually want it to happen, or are you suggesting that because you know it cannot be done and that it would cause, you'd never get it done. It would never happen. And so you just, in effect, you create a dam to access by not being able to complete your part of the deal. It's really a challenging issue.
Look at what you've done, Gabrielle. You've opened up this can of worms for Nephi.
No, but I also wonder if he were to tax firearms and place, like you said, 70% of them on the NFA list, how many of these 7 to 8 million new gun owners, a lot of them from California, where it was very difficult to procure guns, but they did, surprisingly, pre-COVID and during COVID. How many of these people are going to have buyer's remorse, maybe if they voted a certain way or if they didn't expect this to happen? It kind of goes counter to what the trends we saw with all these new people buying guns and this kind of surge in purchases. Does it kind of trickle down to people? Do they say, like, I didn't think this would happen, or I didn't expect this to happen, to make it more difficult? Or if there's a retroactive mechanism to it where you'll have to pay retroactively. I don't know if that's entailed in his proposals, but I think there was something about you have to retroactively pay something if you have a so-called modern sporting rifle or
everybody's going to have to pay the tax.
How do you even track that down?
Well, that's what you're setting up
task.
You're setting up the perfect campaign promise for change of the Congress in the midterms to undo that through passing legislation. I mean, that's obviously there's still the president has to sign that, but that's just inviting problems. And I can't see the Biden administration really going down that road, especially on the retroactive application. They can only get done so much, and they're not going to go as far out as all the things that they can think up in a campaign idea leading into an election. They're going to have to actually figure out ways to implement policies.
I can also predict so take the retroactive piece out and just look at the proposal for any new firearm purchases. Right? I can see, to Nephi's point, a pretty compelling constitutional argument in front of a now friendly Supreme Court
yes.
that this is effectively taking away a constitutional right, but you're taxing people out of their constitutional rights. Actually, there's a compelling argument to be made there in front of the Supreme Court on that. So, how they would craft something like that and what that tax might look like, a 2,000% tax, that seems like it would.
It seems high.
It seems like a pretty. Like I wouldn't want to be the solicitor, tagged to argue that case. Let's just put it that way.
No, you make a very good point, because the Heller decision and a few of those other components or cases that have gone to the Supreme Court really look at the reasonable regulation of firearms and primarily envisioned for health and safety purposes and not revenue raising, which is a way to disincentivize ownership and things like that. But you would think also that they would have concerns about an administratively inventing new taxes when that's supposed to originate in the House of Representatives. I mean,
So-
that's a whole different way to go after taxing things, not born from direct authorization through legislation.
So I'm going to blow
You get
everyone.
working around it. Yeah.
Right. So do they even have the statutory authority to implement these types of taxes or fees in the first instance? That'd be another question worth
A question, yeah.
worth
I mean,
pursuing.
if the tax exists and then they already have the authority, the question is, are you expanding it beyond the logical bounds by which the legislation was enacted?
Right. They may have the authority, but is this a reasonable exercise of that authority?
Yeah, right.
And when you're looking at something under the light of a constitutional right, much to this is for Rudy Giuliani, who I'm sure is listening to this.
I'm sure
there are
he's got
different
nothing
levels
better
of
to- he's got
scrutiny.
nothing better to do.
There are different levels of scrutiny that apply, and when it's a constitutional review, you're looking at what's called strict scrutiny, right? Like it there has to be an absolutely, to Mike's point, it has to be an absolutely compelling reason to enact, to do something, right?
Yeah, and no other means to accomplish it.
no other way to
Yeah.
accomplish it that affects a constitutional right. So for Rudy Giuliani out there, what you were looking for was, yes, strict scrutiny is the scrutiny level that I want to apply to this argument. There are, when it's not constitutional, you can look at there's a rational basis test, right? Which is what the agency's doing rationally related to the objective they're trying to achieve, and it's a much lower bar, and there's a lot more flexibility. But when you're talking about your Second Amendment right, you're not going to have a rational basis test apply, and so it's going to be just from the legal side of this. You have the political piece of this, right, and you have the revenue piece of this, but then you have the legal piece of this. And I think the legal piece of this, there's a compelling argument that if the Biden administration pursues this, it will be tough to see it upheld.
There's so
sorry, Gabrielle, I've gone off on this. We've gone off on this tangent and kind of
That was great, actually, because I forgot about the rational test and all that. I don't know this since I'm not a lawyer, but it's enlightening to me. So I think the listeners will agree too.
I do want to throw something out there that's going to blow everyone's mind in terms of these NFA items and Form 4s and everything. And this is a question that I would love to get answered. Guess what they do? Guess what questions you have to answer when you fill out your paperwork for an NFA item? What's that?
You have tattoos?
No tattoos. You should get them though. That'd be awesome if you got you had a number that they etch on your skin. When you but when you
that's not cool.
No, it's not. That's been done before. It really was uncool.
So let me tell. So here's the interesting thing, that it's the same questions. It's the same background check that you did when you went to pick up a gun at Sportsman's Warehouse. They're the same questions.
Ask it again, but you gotta pay more.
That's right. You get a $200 tax stamp, and then it's a paper process, so it takes 6 months to go through the process but it's literally the same background check. It's the same systems that are being dinged as the automatic system that you're running at Sportsman's Warehouse, which makes you ask the question, which I would ask, why don't we just make the NICS system work efficiently and do away with the whole wait period? You should be able to, if you can pass the questions, because they're the same questions. It's the exact same laws. You should be able to buy a suppressor at Sportsman's Warehouse just like you buy a 1022 Ruger at Sportsman's Warehouse. It should literally be no different, and it should be that fast. And the reality is, why they had why we have a $200 tax stamp requirement? Because when they passed that law, the folks who passed it in the 30s, they did it so it would be prohibitively expensive. That's why they did it at the time. But it just never changed. There's never been political will where you've been able to change the amount of the requirement for that tax stamp. I mean, the idea was to,
expensive then.
Yes,
Holy buckets,
the idea was to price people out of the market. That was the purpose of it. And so if you think about that today, one might ask the question, is it relevant today? Should we even be doing it today? And if people can legally, we know this, people who can pass all the background check questions who are legal gun owners, it's safe for them to buy firearms. It's safe for them to buy suppressors. It's safe for them, like, why don't we just do everything that way and have the electronic system actually work? And then people could quit waiting 6 months for these things. They could just purchase them if they can legally purchase them. So just throwing that out there for you.
We could cite Europe as a case study because Europeans use suppressors, and then their instance in crime is really minimal or non-existent. So I don't see any justification from kind of a practical standpoint and also from a criminality standpoint why they would be harder to obtain if their instance, and not that you should regulate a firearm because it's used in a crime more often, but it's used in less crime than reported, and very minimal use, as we all know. So I don't see why, because it looks scary. It was used in James Bond and all these other action movies. I don't know, but Europe is ahead of us. We have to give kudos to them for actually recognizing that it's not a bad tool. It's a good enhancer.
I try not to on that.
I try not to go into firearms tangents too often on this podcast, and so I don't know if I've ever mentioned this here, but it's important to note when you're looking at long guns of any type and the use in crime, including any guns that are identified as quote unquote assault rifles, you're looking at less than 3% of any firearms used in crimes in this country. So the argument that you'd be doing this in order to affect crime, it literally doesn't hold water. And those are facts. You can look those up, go to the FBI sites, look them up yourselves, people. You don't have to trust me.
Join us next week where we continue our conversation with Gabriella Hoffman.